Hey there! Today we're going to talk about the BIOS, and we're going to talk about boot sectors because they're very closely related. We are slowly approaching writing a program in assembly. And you might be thinking, well, don't you already have a Hello World program out there? Yes, I do. It's an old program or an old video, and it's like 47 minutes long. But it has good information. People liked it. So I'm not going to get rid of it. But I'm hoping to try to keep things a little bit more concise or go into detail on a specific topic instead of just saying we're going to do a Hello World program and I'm going to fill your head with all this other stuff that relates, sort of, but not go and do a deep dive because I don't want you to get completely confused by the end of this video. So on this one, we're going to talk about what is the BIOS? What is the boot sector? Because the BIOS calls the boot sector. All right, so let's look up our little friend, the internet. And we'll start with what is the BIOS? And it is short for Basic Input Output System, pronounced BIOS. And there's a picture of a BIOS chip. All right, so when you first turn on your computer, if it's a new computer, it's probably booting into UEFI, which is BIOS's new replacement. The BIOS is a very old system, but if you plan on doing BIOS assembly programming, you're probably going to know that going in. You're doing kind of some retro stuff here. Obviously, we're going to use an emulator, so you don't have to write your own floppy disks and plug it into your computer and reboot it every time you want to test your program. Man, the good old days. Can you imagine having to test your program that way? Anyway, so the BIOS is the old system. However, you can usually still, at least at this time, run legacy BIOS on a computer. So it's not like this is completely gone stuff. You can still technically do this. However, instead of a floppy disk, now you're probably going to use a USB drive. And anyway, we're getting off on a tangent already, and we've barely even started this video. So the BIOS is the thing that happens when your computer first turns on. When you turn your computer on, it's going to do a post. It's going to check that everything's working, that the power is flowing everywhere it needs to, and once it's confirmed everything is working properly on your computer, it's going to call the BIOS chip, which is pre-programmed for you to make your life easier. Gotta love that. So what the BIOS will do is it will look for the boot sector. So what is a sector? Well, a sector is this. It's this little pizza slice here on this pizza pie with a hole in the middle, which represents a platter on a disk. So in the olden days, we had these things called hard disks. And now we have SSDs and all this fun stuff, but a hard disk was a series of these heads, these platters. A platter is basically like a vinyl record, and a head is one of the sides of your vinyl record. So you had a platter, you had a head, and then you had sectors. You also had cylinders. They said track first. That's kind of funny, actually, especially what this page is about. But if you imagine all these little platters are stacked on top of each other, this circle would make a cylinder. So you're actually specifying your memory location in 3D space. Now, isn't that interesting? We went from three-dimensional to one-dimensional, because technically your addresses are just like one giant line now these days. So they were sophisticated back in the day. They used 3D space. So you would specify something by saying what cylinder you wanted, which head, and which sector. And the sector we specifically want is the boot sector, which is 512 bytes, which basically all your sectors will be. And it will start at a very specific address, and it will load up your computer from there. And that really is what the BIOS and boot sector are. Now, there's a couple other things with the BIOS. You might recall I said it makes your life easier. So you might say, well, how does it do that? And it does that through the interrupt system. If you imagine a computer processor just chugging along, doing its own thing in basically a little while loop or whatever, it's doing its job. And keyboards used to use interrupts back in the day as well. Let's say you press a key on the keyboard. Unless you say, "Hey keyboard, did anyone press a key on you recently?" Which is what USB keyboards do. They constantly are asking, "Did you do something? Did you do something?" They used to use interrupts, which is the keyboard actually going to the computer. "Hey, stop whatever you're doing. I just did something." And the computer goes, "Oh, you did? Well, let's see. What did you do?" It's kind of like a parent with a little child. What did you do? I want to see it. As opposed to also the parent with the little child. "Did you do something? Did you do something?" Oh, and it looks like I clipped on that too. I'm sorry for all of you wearing headphones. So, anyway, the interrupt process, to get back at it, is when you're running your program, what you'll do is you will set registers, which are basically global variables inside of the computer. There's one called AH, and you'll set it to 0, let's say for your video mode. AH means, well, A is for the accumulator, or A. H is for the high-end byte. AL is a low-end byte. And you might say, "I want 00 in AH," and you'll say 3 into AL. And that says, "I want to set the video mode to 3, which means something. It means a text-only display. And then what you'll do is you'll call interrupt 10H, which is 10 hexadecimal. And the processor will go, "Oh, you interrupted me with 10H. I see that you have set your variables to 0 and 3. I will go do that for you right now." So the BIOS is familiar with your basic hardware. You have things like your video services. You have things like your disk services, being able to read and write things, verify them, format things. It just keeps going and going. Serial port things. This is great. Find a computer with a serial port on it anymore, but this would have been so handy when that was commonplace. That's basically what USB has essentially tried to replace. They made a much more harder, complicated system that is faster. And if you know what you're doing, it has a lot of capabilities. But this was just such a bare bones, easy system. There was no standard. The standard was the thing you were talking to knew what you were trying to say, and the two of you figured it out. Anyway, then there's miscellaneous systems, and here's your keyboard services. This is how you get your keyboard stuff in and out. This actually will do with asking the keyboard. Obviously, different systems work slightly differently. Printers, etc., so on and so forth. Clocks, we get the idea. Basically, the BIOS helps you do all this, so you're not just plugging ones and zeros everywhere. You can say, "Hey, you have some code in you. Do the thing I want you to do." All right, well, that explains really the BIOS. So what is it? It is a process that's loaded up when you first turn on your computer. It looks at the boot sector, which is a very specific little pizza slice here, for code. And that code needs to start in a certain spot and end a certain way so that it knows it's valid and that it's not just garbage out there. Otherwise, if you are old enough to remember floppy disks and you accidentally left one in the computer and then you turned it on, it would say non-system disk found, and it wouldn't boot your computer till you took the floppy disk out and restarted it. That's why I looked at the floppy and said, "Oh, the boot sector is not what I'm expecting." And then the BIOS makes your life easier by having these interrupts that you can interrupt things with. There we go. So we have covered it. I hope you found this educational, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. Hopefully in that one, we will actually start working away and doing some assembly. We will see you then.